Up next, we've got measuring tools and marking aids. So now we're just going to go through a series of things that are helpful to us as we measure our garments, ourselves, and we're creating patterns and those different kinds of things. I'm just going to give a brief overview of some helpful and assisting tools. So firstly, we're going to go into our measurement tools as far as like the tape measurers and those kinds of things. So again, in the basic sewing kit, we discuss tape measurers, and you have your tape measurer that just covers the normal 60 inches. And I usually use this for clients when I'm measuring bodies for custom garments, or if I'm measuring length for hemming a dress. So I use the 60 inch. Then you have the extra long measuring tape, which is double that. And it comes in at about 120 inches. So this is obviously much longer, and you use this when you're measuring train lengths and those kinds of things. It's very helpful in assisting with that. So those are the two types of measuring tapes that I use. Then we go along here and we have this sort of retractable snap measuring tape. I think I got this with one of my fabric orders, and then you just kicked in a free tape measure. I don't use it quite as often, but it's another helpful tool in measurement and hems and those kinds of things. And it just retracts. And it's just something that you can use as another assisting tool for your measurements. Okay. Next, we have the seam gauge that we use to measure. The seam gauge we use, and again, that just allows us to measure shorter distances, seams, obviously as in its name. And it gives you this starting point here and this ending point, and you just adjust based on what measurement you need. And this is really useful when you're just trying to measure short seams. And I like how it stays in place here, so you don't have to, with a ruler, you kind of have to keep some sort of mark, maybe keep your finger there or something like that. But with the seam gauge, it's like wherever you put it, it pretty much stays there. And this gauge here allows you to see the distance in between the measurements. So seam gauges, you want to maybe have a couple of these laying around just for your benefit. Again, they usually come with an assortment of other sewing tools, so you usually can buy them together or just buy a couple by themselves. Okay, so next we have some of the marking. Oh, we still can cover a couple of measurement tools. So these are some of the more, I would say, a bit of advanced tools you're going to be using, especially when we go into doing our dressmaking and our pattern making. These are some of the useful measurement tools you want to have that I kind of want to run through. So you might have heard me mention a couple of times getting this 2-inch by 18-inch grid ruler. And this is going to be something that you use constantly. They usually run between, I'm going to say 15 and 20 bucks. I know Amazon has them online. I'm a little wary about ordering things on Amazon, especially sewing tools, because you can always get a cheaper option. Like you think you're paying because it looks like what you want, and then when you get it and you realize it doesn't really hold up. These things are kind of like fragile without much assistance, but you want to get the best quality you can because you don't want to have to keep buying it over and over. So this bends pretty nicely, and I use it, if you can tell, it's pretty worn, but I use it constantly, and it gives you all kinds of measurement lengths. And what I like about it is it's see-through and clear, as you'll see with many of the other tools, and it allows you to give better measurements because you're able to see through and use each of these little squares as sort of a measurement guide. So that's why this is kind of essential for your dressmaking and your sewing. If you get no other measurement tool, no other ruler, you definitely want to get the grid ruler. Okay. And then we have these other sort of assistants, and these come in handy, again, if you're altering a pattern, of course the L shape, if you're altering a pattern, if you're especially in pattern making, you want to have as many different kinds of tools as possible because you're going to create different curves and shapes. So these are just some of the rulers that I use in pattern making, and they don't have to be too pricey or expensive. The main deal is that it has that shape. And these are just some of the basic rulers as you can probably get from any art shop. Okay, this you cannot get from an art shop. This is a hip ruler, and again, I'm one for the clear ones. They have this in a metallic version, but I just picked up this one. She's a little bit She's a little bit injured. I had to tape her back together. But yes, and it runs, again, about 15, 20 bucks for these. I would say go into a store and make sure this is what you want, because you might pick up like a good deal on Amazon and then you get it and you realize they're already pretty fragile and what you're getting is an even cheaper quality. So, but these are going to be what helps you in making curves and creating the hip adjustments when you're working on a pattern. It also does armholes and those kinds of things. So this is definitely something you want to invest in as well. And then we have my favorite, the French curve. And this isn't so much about measurement as it is about the actual shape itself. You're going to use this especially in pattern making when you're creating different kinds of adjustments and seams. The French curve is what we used to call it in school. It's something that you're going to find quite beneficial. So I would definitely say invest in one of these as well. So those are just some of the rulers that I use. Here you'll see in the textbook, it says combine set, square, and curve, and this sort of like has, it's like there's some that are like all in ones. I have yet to been able to find this any place, and I think at this point I've accumulated so many of the other smaller ones that I just kind of go with that. But if you can get ones that are combined, obviously it helps as far as like taking up space and those kinds of things. So you can either go with this or maybe just buy this and a couple of the L-shaped rulers to help you out. So next we're going to go into some of the marking tools. I didn't cover the flexible ruler because that's not something I have. And I often, when I'm trying to, the flexible ruler is mostly when you're measuring seams around a curve. And I've just found it easier to just, or the same, to just use the tape measure to get those same curves. You may want to invest in a flexible ruler for your own benefit. I find that when I need to create or measure around a curve, if my hip ruler doesn't do it, then I'll just use a regular tape measure to get it done. As far as the grid ruler or the mat rather, this huge mat, if you notice my entire table is a giant mat. If you notice the squares, and even if you come down this way, my entire table is just one giant grid map. And I bought this at Joann's a couple of years ago. And it's just really helpful as far as measuring and marking and cutting fabric and those kinds of things when you have this sort of table mat measurement tool. I measure yardage with it. I do quite a few things with it. So it's kind of like an all-in-one if you're looking for like really large measurements and cutting, and it has so many uses. I definitely encourage you, if you can, they have one that's the cardboard, which I had for a little while, but I wasn't crazy about. And then I just stuck with this one that I actually use quite a bit more than I ever used the other one. So I definitely say invest in this like large grid mat for your sewing table. It's going to be very useful as far as measurements and marking and even cutting fabric. Okay, so the next one we're going to go into now is the marking aids, and these are the things that are going to help you mark your fabric and mark your pattern so that you can sew more effective, efficient garments that you're not going to have to constantly unpin, seam rip, and not enjoy sewing because you're so focused on why is this not looking the way I want it to look. It often almost always comes down to how the pattern is marked. They always say you measure twice, cut once. I say measure 10 times until you're short, because once you cut, there's no going back. Okay, I want to first talk about the Tailors Chalk, and I have this blue Tailors Chalk is to show you what I initially started to use when I was marking. I work with a lot of fine fabrics, as I've said several times, and this has a bit of a more waxy feel to it. I don't particularly like it because some of the fabrics that I work with, I find that it doesn't smoothly go across the fabric. For example, I have this sheer chiffon, and all right, that wasn't the greatest example, but normally it doesn't go across that smoothly, and it usually pulls the fabric, it bunches, and it doesn't give me a smooth feel when I'm pulling it across. It usually pulls and it drags the fabric, and I don't like that feeling. And I also found that with this more waxy one, it's supposed to sort of like just like rub right off, or when you apply heat to it, it comes off. I've had instances, unfortunately, where it doesn't. And as you can see, that's a very obvious line there. And when you're hemming or altering or doing anything with a garment, you don't want it to look like you altered it, meaning you don't want there to be obvious markings on the garment. When you're tailoring a garment, when you're creating a garment from scratch, you want it to look as professional as possible, and having these obvious marks where you've sort of messed with it is not going to be something that's going to come off well. So you want something that comes off almost immediately after you use it, so it stays on long enough for you to get the work done, and then it comes off usually with heat or just over time it fades away. So that's when I started to discover what I bought from Amazon. Yes, I actually made an Amazon purchase. It's called Rabbit Chalk, that's the brand, but it's actually just a series of what we call magic or disappearing chalk. I show this example because I saw a lot of reviews of people saying, I bought this and it's all broken and the pieces are all over the place. I don't know if it's what makes this chalk so great and also kind of sucks, is the chalk is very thin and it breaks like for nothing. And this is not just because of Amazon, because I bought some from Joann in the full packaging, and I've gotten home and once it hits the floor, it shatters. It's done. This does not, maybe they could figure out a better way to package it, I suppose, to keep it from doing that. But this chalk, it breaks fairly easy, but I'm fine with that because it gets the job done. And why I say that is because even though it breaks fairly easy, which is probably why they give you like so much of it, is because it actually does what it says it's going to do. So when I probably should use this so you can see it better. So when the mark is a lot brighter, so it's very much, you can see it, but usually with either running your finger across it a couple of times, definitely with heat. I'm trying to create the heat effect with my finger here. And again, with like actual heat from the iron board, it's even a little bit more fainter than the one you saw from here with the blue chalk versus here. And it actually, when you run an iron over it, it's completely gone. Like when you run an iron over this, it doesn't completely go away, I've noticed over time. So I've kind of become a stickler for using the disappearing chalk. And like I said, especially on fine fabrics, once you run that iron over it, it almost always completely disappears. Now, when I say always, I haven't had a time yet where it hasn't completely disappeared, but it's important that you test. Anytime you are using any of these marking aids, you don't automatically go on to the fabric that you're going to be sewing on. You want to test first to see what effect, because even though the packaging says it'll disappear, it's water soluble, you might find that on this particular fabric, it doesn't quite have that effect. And that's not, when you're sewing a project, that's not when you want to learn. When you're almost done with a project, or if you got it mostly done, that's not when you want to learn, oh, this actually doesn't work for this particular fabric. So what you'll hear a lot about as I'm going through the instruction is for you to always test your marking tools and test before you actually go on and create on the actual fabric you want to use. But again, I enjoy the disappearing chalk because once you iron over it, it almost always goes away. The drawback that I've discovered, you may not have this same issue, is it has, because it dissolves, and I'm assuming it has something to do with these like crystals that you may be able to see. When you're using it, especially when you're cutting with it, it's almost like a dust that comes off of it. And I find myself sneezing and it is not comfortable. So sometimes I have to weigh out, like, is this worth it? But right now, this is what I found to be most effective. And I'd rather have a little bit of an itchy nose and maybe I can just wear a mask as I'm cutting it than to have a damaged, very expensive garment, you know, that's been messed up by all kinds of measuring marking aids. So I definitely say the smell that comes off of it, I think it has something to do with the fact that it disappears, and that sort of consistency might make it more susceptible to just like fading in the air and creating this sort of like nasty little dust cloud. It's not too bad, but definitely something you should be aware of. And again, I say I usually just put on a mask when I'm cutting or just kind of power through. Okay, so that's what I use as one of my marking tools. I also recently discovered the water soluble pen. And this is also another great tool, especially when I'm doing with my patterns and those kinds of things. This has actually been really good to me. The setback is it's bright purple, so it terrifies me because it's bright purple. And when I'm working with bridal garments, I'm like, oh my goodness, bright purple, you know. But I've seen, like, when I've done my test, it does, within 24 hours, it's completely gone. And then sometimes it's a lot easier to use this than it is to use the chalk, because the chalk doesn't always go on smoothly and evenly. Sometimes it skips or it's just not compatible with the type of fabric you're using. So I would definitely say pick up a couple of water soluble pens, test the fabric before you actually put it on there. But these two, within 24 hours, they do fade. The downside to that is if you mark something and you're like, I'll work on it tomorrow, and you fully marked it out and then decided that the next day is when you're going to sew it, you are to understand that all those marks are gone. I've been there. It's happened to me before. I didn't trust that it was completely water soluble. I put it on a pattern that I was going to, or a muslin or a toil that I was going to work on the next day, and all the markings were gone and I had to redo it the next day. So I definitely say if you're going to work on it, do it the same day, because if it says it's water soluble, trust them to an extent. Okay. So those are some of the marking tools I use. In addition, I also use this pencil, and this another, it says Dressmaker's marking pen. This is another tool that you can use to mark it. And this little brush at the end is just to sort of like scrape away or dust away sort of like the marks. Full disclosure, I haven't seen it yet where I've made a mark and then I've been able to do this. You see, it's still there. Like it's cute, but I haven't had an instance where I've been able to do this mark and then it just went away. It's been like, so I don't use this I use this as a hem only, but when I'm hemming, but only when I know for sure I'm cutting that piece away. So I use it for like seam allowance, and definitely something that I know that I'm going to cut away, that you're not going to see any mark. I use the tailoring chalk when it's going to probably be someplace that you may see it, but that's fine because it will go away. So you just want to, again, test, see what works for your marking tools, but always use a scrap of fabric that is the same or similar to what you're going to use for the actual project, but not the project itself. Okay, so we've covered some of the measuring tools. We covered some of the marking tools. Lastly, I wanted to get into the tracing paper and the wheel. So this is just your standard tracing paper. I picked it up at my local craft store. The sheets are pretty short. And as you can see, it's a little bit worn. You can see where the tracing wheel has gone over it a couple of times. And once we get into our patterns, you'll see exactly what it's used for, but just a brief overview of it. Essentially, you have your pattern underneath. And for example, you have it on the right side. And now you want to do the other side, but sometimes it gets tricky if you're trying to create symmetry and you're off a little bit. High fashion sewing is about precision to like the 10th power. So everything is about precision. So the tracing allows you to have the symmetry because you're essentially just copying one thing to the other side. And what you would normally do is, first of all, be very careful, because usually, like I have this one where it's doubled. And unfortunately, when it's double, that means whatever I do to one side is going to be on the other. So I have to be careful what's underneath it, what's on top of it. But it usually just requires this. And then you have the pattern here, as you see in the example they have. And for example, you're creating a dart and you just sort of run it along here. And you use the tracing wheel to like run it over. And then when you open it, there you go. I don't know if you guys can see it. Now you've got your line. This is pretty much vital to pattern making, or even when you're doing a store-bought pattern. These are kind of vital. The setback to these is, from the ones that I've had, they do not always, the marks do not always come up with the hot iron. It says it on the packaging, but that's not always true. So what I use in addition to this, I usually use this for like my toils or things that I'm just doing like as a test pattern. But what I use on the actual garment is a technique called tailoring tacks. And that's something that we're going to cover a little bit further along. And that's normally what I use. That's my tried and true method. I use this more in the station of my sewing, when I'm doing the toil, when I'm doing my test pattern, then I don't care about any of that stuff, marking. I mean, because this is not going to be the main fabric anyway. But when I'm doing the actual garment, I use almost exclusively tailoring tacks, because that way the thread comes out and I don't have to worry about any stray marks. Okay, so that covers the measuring and marking tools portion of the Know Your Tools segment. So let's move on. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Videos are uploaded weekly covering dressmaking, fashion, lectures, and more.